In today's video, we're checking out the new flagship hybrid mirrorless camera from Panasonic. This is the LUMIX S1R Mark II. Consider this not only an upgrade to the original S1R, but in many ways an upgrade to the S5 Mark II and X. The S1R Mark II has a brand new 44.3 megapixel full-frame sensor and a killer feature set which includes 8.1K internal recording, 32-bit float audio support, active cooling, uncropped 4K 60p, and 6K 60p, all with full autofocus support. This camera has raw internal recording, LUMIX Lab support, and yes, we finally have a LUMIX full-frame mirrorless camera that can now shoot 4K 120p. This new camera also has the best fully articulating touchscreen I've ever used. Let's get into it. Welcome back, folks. My name's Shane. The LUMIX S1R Mark II is finally here. The launch price of this camera is 5,499 Australian dollars, 3,299 US dollars, and about 3,649 euros. As mentioned in the intro, this is a beast of a hybrid camera. It has essentially everything we've seen in cameras like the S5 Mark II X, GH7, and G9 Mark II, and some new features we haven't seen on any other model. There are also some compromises with this camera which we'll discuss coming up. While the name suggests this is just an upgrade to the S1R, it's more of its own high-resolution hybrid standalone camera. If you're upgrading from the original S1R, this makes sense, and if you're looking for a higher resolution video camera from that of the S5 Mark II or X, or even the S1H, the S1R Mark II might fit the bill depending on your shooting scenario. Now, I've been testing this camera's video and photographic performance out here in Australia during summer. I've shot with it on a tripod, on a gimbal, I've done plenty of handheld work with this, and I've got a lot to say about it. We'll talk about the pros and cons of this camera throughout the video, using it in real-world scenarios, not just in a studio environment, because I have quite a bit to say about how this performed under certain shooting scenarios. Just a quick disclaimer before we get into this video, this camera is just on loan from Panasonic. They're not sponsoring the video. I didn't accept any free gifts, and guess what? There's no annoying ad read either. So if you do enjoy the video, please leave a thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed already, please do so. Click the bell for all notifications because I have a full deep dive beginner's guide to this camera coming up very soon after this video. Also note, this is on pre-release firmware, but it's close to final, so everything I'm going to cover in this video should be accurate to the release of this camera, which is in March of 2025. There'll also be a new firmware update at some point in 2025 offering 8.1K and 7.2K open gate recording options in the future, which will give you a massive amount of pixels to work with in post-production. I tested 3 firmware versions on this camera before putting this final review together. Now, I noticed some bugs up until the last one, and those have all been now addressed with this current version. So yeah, this works as expected, and I have no problems recommending its functionality straight out of the box on the most part. Let's get into it. All right, let's talk about the camera body here, because this camera body is awesome and it weighs only 795 grams, which is only 59 grams heavier than the S5 Mark II X and about 21% less than the original S1R, which weighs just over 1 kilogram. The grip feels essentially the same as the S5 Mark II X in the hand, and the white balance and ISO and exposure compensation buttons are all in the same spot. If you like to shoot in the elements, this camera is weatherproof, operating from -10 to +40 Celsius. We get a nice red record button on the front of the camera, which is great for shooting video, along with the regular red record button on the top. Much like the G9 Mark II, there's no audio button on this camera, but you can of course map one to one of the custom function buttons or the D-pad on the back if you need it. The wheel near the shutter feels the same as the S5 Mark II X, as does the rear thumb wheel over here. Some people had issues with this rear thumb wheel, its overall placement, and how easily or accidentally it could be knocked when shooting out in the field. Now, I never really found this to be an issue personally, but thanks to the new lever on the back over here, very reminiscent of like the GH7 or S1H or whatever, then you can lock your settings once you're rolling. This lever is pretty wild as it disables the wheels, dials, screen, D-pad, and joystick from modifying any of your settings while you're shooting. There's a custom function button on the front of the camera up here, a remote port on the top right, and a pair of microphones on the top. This camera uses the same BMW BLK22 battery found in all of the modern LUMIX cameras since the S5. This is great if you're already rocking an S5, S5 Mark II or GH7. It's the same battery as all of those cameras. USB-C power delivery is also available via the USB-C port on the side. If you want to record externally to an SSD, this camera will also work with a dummy battery. I've tested it with mine, it works fine. This body has a new 3-mode control lever on the left-hand side, which allows you to set the camera in photo, video, or in S&Q mode. Switching modes between photo and video also changes the menu system on this camera. This feels a lot easier to manage now because each menu is distinct to the mode that you're shooting in. While S&Q mode does share the same menu as the video mode, it's great having an independent menu for the photo settings. This camera also still suffers from the same S&Q and video mode bug found on other cameras. So say for example, we're shooting 4K at 30p in our regular recording mode. I go into S&Q mode and I change that to 1080p at 120 frames per second. If we switch back into video mode, the camera is now at HD instead of 4K where I left it. I'm not a big fan of this and I hope they can fix this in the future. Now that we don't switch into S&Q or movie mode using the main command dial anymore, we now have access to 5 custom preset modes. The benefit of this new system and command dial is you can set up 5 modes when it comes to your photo modes, 5 independent modes for video, and 5 independent modes for S&Q. So my nitpick before about it changing modes if you're going through the camera manually is still valid, but now that we've got so many C1 through 5 options on the top here, it's definitely going to make life a lot easier. While this camera took me a day or two to get my head around, I absolutely love this setup. There's also a bunch of additional custom modes you can store within the camera's menu system and recall them if need be. We now get red tally lamps on the front and back of the camera so you know exactly when you're recording. Whether you're the talent in front of the camera or talentless like me, you know exactly when you're rolling. Now my S5 Mark II I'm shooting this with doesn't have tally lights, so I've got an external monitor right over here with a big red record ring around it. So I know I'm rolling, but tally lights are absolutely invaluable. There's also one on the back and you can fully customize how bright they are, or you can turn them completely off. On the back of the camera, we've got a nice high-resolution 5.76 million dot EVF. While this is the same resolution as the original S1R, it's a nice bump in resolution from the 3.86 million dot EVF on the S5 Mark II or X. You can also set the refresh rate of the EVF to either 60 or 120 frames per second. While I don't use electronic viewfinders much anymore, this has been an absolute pleasure to use. You use it for both photo and video work, or if it's a bright day, you can use it just for cycling through the menu system. The only 2 downgrades over the original S1R is that there's no top LCD screen anymore, and this seems to be in the direction of which Panasonic are moving, and the touchscreen or flippy screen back here is slightly lower resolution. But it's not all bad news. This camera has the best implementation of a fully articulating touchscreen I've ever used so far, and this can flip out like most fully articulating touchscreens. You can use it in selfie mode like this, flip it back and have it centered for video work, much like the GH6 and 7. You can pull it out this way as well, flip it down like that, hold it up and angle it in any orientation you like. So this really sets it apart from basically every other Lumix camera currently in their line. And if you like to work in tricky situations, or if you have to work in tricky situations, having a fully articulating screen like this is awesome. I haven't used another camera with a fully articulating screen that can do all of this before, and I found it very handy when shooting video because I can set it up for more of an ergonomic experience behind the camera rather than always just looking off to the side slightly. Let's cover this new sensor and dynamic range. So the S1R Mark II is loaded with a new 44.3 megapixel sensor capable of up to 14 plus stops of dynamic range when shooting in vlog. The camera can also shoot all the way up to 8.1K video at 30p or 25p if you're in the PAL region with a 17:9 aspect ratio. If you're a photographer, the handheld high resolution mode can now output a whopping 177 megapixel image, which is absolutely crazy. The S1R Mark II also features a new dynamic range expansion or DRE video mode, which increases the dynamic range by about a stop when shooting in vlog. Panasonic also made mention that this dynamic range expansion mode is best used in well-lit scenarios rather than in low-light scenarios where they just recommend leaving it off. Now, if you take a look at this side by side, you can see that the shot with DRE on is exposed slightly brighter overall. So this might give you more information in the shadows. if it's a bright, sunny scenario like this. But just know once you color correct everything, I didn't see that much of a difference in the footage at the end of the day, and you can be the judge for yourself. Rolling shutter performance is also affected by this new mode. So here's an example of the S1R Mark II shooting 4K 25p, and as you can see, the rolling shutter performance looks solid. As soon as dynamic range expansion is turned on, you can see how much more jelly the same shot looks. Overall, the rolling shutter performance is about the same as the S5 Mark II or X with dynamic range expansion off. If you plan on shooting anything with a lot of movement, leave this mode off, but for static shots, it will do a good job. While getting an extra stop at dynamic range is always appreciated, I don't love how this works in the menu system. So for starters, you have to turn dynamic range expansion on or off. And if you've got it on and you want to switch to, say, 4K at 120 frames per second, which doesn't support that particular feature, you have to turn it off and then go back down into the video menu and select the video mode that you want. You can't just switch on the fly. Now, there's a couple of ways around this. You can save custom modes and do all that kind of stuff, but I would much prefer to see a pop-up message letting me know that it's off if I switch from one mode that supports it into one mode that doesn't. It's just a lot faster. One of the cool upgrades with this camera is we get a sensor curtain that you can turn on and off in the menu system. So when I power the camera off, it can bring the curtain down. This is a huge help for people maybe shooting wildlife, or if you're shooting outdoors like I do a lot. If you want to change lenses, you're not going to get dust on the sensor. Now, if you're someone who likes to use hybrid zoom on another Lumix camera, this high resolution sensor gives you some massive benefits. Using the 20 to 60mm kit lens, shooting in 4K, I can punch all the way into 125mm on the tight end with a 60mm lens. That's crazy. Using hybrid zoom in HD or 1080p, I can punch all the way into 251mm, which is crazy. While the reach is insane, there's definitely a drop of quality when shooting in HD. I think 4K is the sweet spot here for this hybrid zoom feature. Hybrid zoom is one of my favorite features for travel. You can pack one lens and get so much more reach out of it. If you're shooting with a prime lens, give crop zoom a shot. Now, crop zoom is kind of similar to how hybrid zoom works with zoom lenses, but it's made for prime lenses. When shooting in 4K with a 50mm prime, I can zoom between 50mm and 104mm, essentially doubling my focal length. In HD 1080p, the reach goes to 209mm. This is pretty wild. And if you want access to this feature nice and fast, you can map a custom function button to the camera. I've mapped it to the right control on this D-pad. Again, because of the sensor's resolution, you can crop in far more than what you could on a 25 megapixel sensor. The S1R Mark II has dual media card bays. We get a CFExpress Type B card slot and a UHS 2 card slot next to it. While the CFExpress card will allow you to shoot ProRes RAW internally, you can shoot 8.1K 420 10-bit, no problems to the SD card slot. I tested all these modes using a V90 SD card, and my pro-grade CFExpress Type B card had no issues recording RAW internally. I'll link down to my cards in the description if you want to check those out. Much like many of the other recent cameras, you can also record out to SSD drives thanks to the USB-C port on the side, which makes your file transfer pretty much redundant. You can plug a drive into this, plug it into your computer, and start editing your files. The S1R Mark II has the most amount of recording modes I've ever seen on a camera. It's crazy. If you can't find something that you like on this, you're doing something wrong. We get 3 main lists of codecs, including MP4, MOV, and Apple ProRes. If you want, you can shoot 5.8K RAW, and you can find that at the top of the list. This is a pixel-to-pixel readout because the sensor is a lot larger than the 5.7K aspect ratio. The image quality in shooting RAW is unreal. It has such a nice film-esque style look to it, as you can see from this example. The beauty of RAW is you can fully adjust the ISO and white balance in post-production. You can add all the sort of noise reduction you may need to in post as well. This gives you more flexibility to either match a shot, or if you, say, made a mistake while you were shooting, you can correct it fully in post-production. I also had no issues working with RAW in Final Cut Pro, but from what I understand, Davinci Resolve doesn't support it. Now, I don't use Davinci Resolve, but for Final Cut, it's good, and if you're using the same workflow as me, you won't have any problems. Now, there's a bunch of Apple ProRes formats from HD all the way up to 5.8K 422HQ, which uses a lot less data on your card than RAW would. With the exception of a few 1080p modes, Apple ProRes and RAW can only record to a CFExpress card slot or an external SSD. The MOV menu has 7 pages of recording quality options ranging from 1080p 8-bit 25p all the way up to 8.1K 42010-bit with a 17:9 aspect ratio. Now, I'm a big fan of 5.9K 50p on this camera. It strikes a great balance between resolution, file size, which makes it really easy to edit in post-production. This might be the best thing about the S1R Mark II, in my perspective. Being able to shoot 5.9K at 50p uncropped is killer. I shot a bunch of footage from my friend Herbie at the gym, who's a natural bodybuilder, and I was able to crop in on a 4K timeline and also slow it down by 50% without having to worry about any sort of APS-C crops or anything like that, which ends up changing my end result. Now, unless I'm shooting a short film or documentary where I need a 17:9 aspect ratio, 5.9K with this 16:9 aspect ratio is perfect for what I do. Now, if you prefer to work with DCI or 17:9 aspect ratio formats, there's plenty of resolutions in the camera to choose from. As I mentioned earlier, there'll be a firmware update for the S1R Mark II that gives it both 8.1 and 7.1 OpenGate. Right now, the highest option in OpenGate is 6.4K, which is found in the MOV menu. While there's 4.7K 50 and 60p as an option, it comes with an APS-C crop. It's also worth mentioning that the S1R Mark II doesn't currently have the Mp4 Lite option in the menu. I'm hopeful that that will come with the next firmware update, but I have no information on that, so just fingers crossed we do see that if you like to shoot with an OpenGate aspect ratio, but also save on the data. The S1R Mark II has dual native ISO, and it's different depending on your shooting mode. So say, for example, you're shooting in standard, natural, or vivid, for example. The low base ISO is 80, and the high is 400. If you're shooting in the CineLike profiles, it changes to 160 and 800. For those shooting in Vlog without the dynamic range expansion on, it's 500 on the low end and 2500 on the high. With dynamic range expansion on, it's listed at 400 and 2000. When shooting in photography modes like RAW or JPEG, it's 80 on the low side and 400 on the high. I'm not going to lie, this is pretty complicated, so I suggest writing out a cheat sheet for it. I'll leave these numbers down in the description so you can copy and paste it over to a notepad file or any device you want it saved to. The advantage of a dual native ISO is that the image will clean up again once you hit that high ISO threshold. I found the overall low light performance very usable, at least up to ISO 16000, maybe even higher in a pinch, so the low light performance on this is excellent. Let's cover the S&Q mode on the S1R Mark II because there's a few quirks with this that I need to explain to you. So while this can shoot 4K at 120 frames per second, it comes with a little asterisk over here. So we get about a 1.1 times crop on the image, which isn't a deal breaker whatsoever. It's about the same as what you might find on something like the Sony ZV-E1 or the Sony FX3 or A7S III, for example. So that's fine. But just know if you're shooting 4K 120 frames per second on the S1R Mark II, it will revert back to DFD autofocus. I can't believe it. I thought for sure this wouldn't be the case. The G9 Mark II Micro Four Thirds camera loses the subject detection modes at 4K 120, but you still get phase hybrid autofocus. On this, it doesn't seem to be the case, so food for thought there if you plan on shooting a lot of 4K 120. It's not all doom and gloom though, so if you switch it down to 4K at 60 frames per second, you get full tracking and full phase hybrid autofocus with no crops, and it looks absolutely beautiful. So I would consider this to be a great 4K 60p camera with limitations on the 4K 120. And just know 1080p is capped at 120 frames per second. We don't get any of the same 1080p or 180p settings we saw on the S9, S5 Mark II or X. I think this kind of hints that these features might end up on another camera at some point in the future. While S&Q mode shooting 4K 120p doesn't give you phase detection autofocus, the only workaround I found for this is if you switch the camera back to movie mode and you shoot in pixel to pixel mode at 4K at 100 or 120p, you get phase detection back. So it's a bit of a workaround. There is a crop there, but it is what it is. If you need it, it is in the camera. While there are some limitations in the S&Q modes on this camera, the footage coming off this sensor is really beautiful. All right, let's talk about autofocus for video. We have all the same modes we've seen in recent LUMIX releases, including human, animal, car, motorcycle, train, and plane tracking. This puts it right in line with the rest of the cameras in the range. Human detection works great, and after testing this final firmware, I have no problems recommending this for anyone who's doing any sort of video work. While the S5 Mark II and X had some quirky autofocus performance issues in certain modes, this basically eliminates it in most of the standard readouts. So if you're in movie mode, everything in that menu will have phase hybrid autofocus, except for one mode, which is 4K at 120 frames per second. So if you're shooting in that mode, you want to switch the camera into pixel to pixel mode and you get phase detection autofocus back. I covered this on a prior section, but if you just skipped ahead to the autofocus section, I just thought I'd throw it in. The S1R Mark II gives us a brand new tracking system, so you can set a box up wherever you like on screen, and say for example you've got car detection enabled or vehicle, then as soon as it sees a car and it enters that box, it will then begin tracking. I much prefer this. You don't have to sort of half press the shutter, touch on the screen and move things around with the joystick. It's a lot easier to get your subject tracked. I tested tracking with vehicle, human, and animal tracking, and as soon as somebody or something enters that box, it will begin tracking, and it seems nice and sticky. One of the new features Panasonic added for video is called false color. This allows you to see exposure on screen with a color guide to help you find 18% middle gray, which is indicated in green. There's also a handy little color chart built into the menu which helps indicate different exposure levels. All of the Filmmaker tools, including vector scope, waveform, shutter angle, the red recording ring on screen, spot metering, and everything else is built into this camera. If something is missing between this and the S5 Mark IIX, I haven't found it. One of my favorite things about the S1R Mark II is the video IBIS Performance. It's absolutely amazing. Panasonic call this Active IS. Now this offers slightly better performance over the S5 Mark IIX in one way, and that's because of this new e-stabilization mode. It's called cropless, which gives you the benefits of e-stabilization without a crop. This is due to the sensor having more room to position the full resolution recorded image, that it doesn't need to crop in like it does on smaller or less megapixel sensors. Here's a quick example of an 18mm lens on the S1R Mark II without any of the image stabilization. And now with the e-stabilization set to cropless, I get exactly the same field of view, but much better image stabilization. We still get standard mode, which gives you a slight crop, but it gives you even better stabilization again, and this is my preferred mode. If you need really aggressive in-body image stabilization, then set it to high, and as you can see with this example, I can run with the camera even with a wide-angle lens like this, and it looks really stable. The color science overall is very similar to the S5 Mark IIX or GH7. Any minor difference can be corrected in post-production. Looking at a side-by-side comparison, it's close. There might be a tad more saturation on the S1R Mark II footage when shooting in Vlog, but it's pretty minimal. This is by no means a clinical test, but I applied the same color grading to both clips, and there's definitely a slight difference. Shooting in the standard profiles, the S1R Mark II definitely looked a little bit hotter in the magenta over my S5 Mark IIX. While there's a lot to like about this camera, the new picture profile looks amazing. It's called CineLike A2, and this particular profile captures more dynamic range than CineLike D and CineLike V, and it gives you a much better end result. Shooting with this profile was an absolute pleasure, and everything that you're looking at on screen is straight out of camera. That's right, it looks this good straight out of camera. I've owned Sony cameras. I think this absolutely wipes the floor with the S-Cinetone profile, but you can be the judge. At the time this camera comes out, I hope there's a new firmware update for the S5 Mark II and all the rest of the cameras in the range that can support this new picture profile, because it looks absolutely beautiful. Let us know what you think. The rest of the standard profiles are built in, including natural, portrait, standard, Leica monochrome. We also, of course, get the real-time LUT option for adding countless amounts of color profiles to the camera. While this camera can support 8K and it's a video beast and it can do all the cool stuff we've spoken about, there's no mention, at least at the time of releasing this video to me personally, whether or not this will support the AARI Log C3 that we saw on the GH7. If we don't get it on this camera, it's a surefire sign that it most likely will come to a separate camera at some point in the future. I have no information on that, but knowing what I know now about the G9 Mark II and GH7 release, I consider the S1R Mark II to be kind of like a G9 Mark II. It does everything. It does it really well, but I have a feeling they might be reserving some of those features for a separate video-centric camera. Let's cover photographic autofocus performance. So we get all the same tracking modes that we've already seen in the video section of this video, but this actually outperformed my expectations. Now there's a few tricks to getting the best out of this, which I'll share with you in just a moment. Now when it comes to the mechanical shutter, I wanted to see how well it would do with Rhiannon zigzagging and running towards the camera, not always looking at it either, and I think the hit rate from these examples on screen showcase just how far the autofocus performance has come. Switching to the electronic shutter option on this camera, I set a one area box up with human tracking right in the center and just had Rhiannon sprint towards the camera. And the hit rate again was sensational. This might look like a video that I'm playing for you, but this is how many photos it took in the time it took Rhiannon to run from the distance up toward the camera. While these are simple tests, I think they illustrate just how well this camera performs. Animal detection on this also works great, so if you're a fan of shooting birds, dogs, cats, whatever, this will do a really great job. Much like the prior cameras, it brings up a yellow box around the target and take a photo and it's in focus. This is great. The tracking modes on these cameras are some of my favorite. Another big upgrade on this camera is the constant preview is now fixed. This means that it's now possible to maintain the exposure preview during autofocus on while shooting in manual mode. This also works when a flash is attached. There's a new menu option in the camera called Preview During Autofocus Operation, where you can toggle this feature on or off. While I am mostly a video shooter, I can appreciate the level of detail on this higher megapixel sensor over the S5 Mark II or X. I noticed it immediately when I viewed the files on a 4K or 5K display. The handheld high resolution mode is fantastic on this camera, producing a massive 177 megapixel image. If this is too big, you can drop it down in the settings of that particular menu option. The burst photography modes on this thing is insane. It offers up to 40 frames per second, blackout free when using the electronic shutter. This is up 10 frames per second even over the S5 Mark II X. In the mechanical shutter mode, you can expect around 10 frames per second with continuous shooting. The S1R Mark II is also equipped with pre-burst, so this offers a choice between 0.5, 1 or 1.5 seconds of pre-capture when the shutter is half pressed. This can be invaluable for wildlife or sport photographers who want to capture the precise moment. The S1R Mark II is compatible with the new DMW XLR2 adapter, which allows you to record 32-bit float internally like the GH7. This camera also fully supports the original DMW XLR1, so if you're still rocking one of those from the days of the GH5, it will give you XLR audio into this camera. I'm actually using it right now with this microphone on my S5 Mark II X. Unlike the S5 Mark II and X though, this camera does not record 4 channels of audio in MOV mode by default, so that annoying issue of having to remove a second stereo track is no longer a problem on this camera. Like many of the recent cameras in the range, you can also adjust the audio input level from either standard to low or change the mic input to line level if you're running it out of a mixer. For best results with the 3.5mm audio jack, have it set to -16 or -18 dB if you're running it in standard mode, and then set your wireless pack or microphone accordingly, and it'll give you really nice results. Now, 4-channel audio is supported if you're using either of the 2 XLR adapters. You don't have to get the newest one to have that. If you're using the XLR1 like I am right now on my S5 Mark II X, it will be compatible with this. Alright, now let's talk about overheating and runtime. So while this camera has active cooling, it can still overheat quite easily. This has to be my biggest nitpick with the S1R Mark II over the S5 Mark II X or GH7. While it is summer here, it was overheating a lot more frequently than I expected and also a lot sooner. Oh, it's overheating, man. Within about 15 minutes or so outside on a bright sunny day, it came up with the overheating message and then it shut down multiple times. This camera overheated 3 or 4 times while shooting the samples with Rhiannon on the bridge. The GH7 we used to shoot the behind the scenes stuff worked non-stop all of the time without overheating, and that was shooting at 5.7K. While it was 34 degrees Celsius outside, which translates to about 93 Fahrenheit, the camera was getting hit by direct sunlight, and it was no doubt well above 40 degrees internally, which is basically the spot where it all shut off. Again, I was only shooting 10 to 20 second clips most of the time, changing modes and doing it again, and it's still overheated. The only way I could kind of help mitigate the overheating was by cranking up the camera's fan to high, and while this helped, it drained the battery way too fast for my liking. Now, to be fair, Panasonic at the time they sent me this camera for review did mention that this isn't the sort of camera that you can let run for extended periods of time without overheating. So they did give me a heads up on this, but I didn't realize it would be as temperamental as it is. Now, I ran a series of tests here in the studio indoors at about 23 degrees Celsius, and I'll put the Fahrenheit on screen, and it performed much better in a studio situation. Shooting 8K 10-bit 420 to the CFExpress Type B card, the overheating warning message came up at around the 31-minute mark. It continued to record to about 58 minutes before finally shutting down. I felt around the camera body and it was very warm to the touch. I also had burned through 3/4 of a fully charged battery in in just under 1 hour shooting 8K. And the fan was set to mode 1, so if I put it up to my ear, I could hear that the fan was working really hard. The back of the body was also quite hot, and even with the flip out screen sort of set back away from the body like this, it was still very hot internally. After letting the camera cool down for almost half an hour, I ran a second test on the S1R set to 4K 50 frames per second 422 10-bit, and sadly, the camera overheated again at the 34-minute mark. The CFExpress card also gets really hot, so I decided to run a second test using the V90 SD card. I waited about 25 minutes or so and started a second recording test shooting 4K 50p to the SD card. And this time I got 1 hour and 14 minutes before the camera again overheated. The battery was about to be fully exhausted as well, so I don't think shooting 4K 50 or 60p you will get more than about an hour and 20 of maximum record time. I ran a final thermal test on this camera shooting 4K at 120p in S&Q mode in the studio with the timeline frame rate set to 25p. I also set the fan on the camera to the highest mode, and for this particular test, it recorded for 45 minutes before again overheating. This actually translates out to 4.8 times more footage than the length of the clip, so just over 3.6 hours. If you live in a colder climate or you're predominantly shooting in a cool studio, odds are this will be fine, but these real-world tests are valid for folks who actually want to take this and shoot it outside, especially in mixed or hot conditions. One of the cool features Panasonic brought back with this camera that's not on the S5 Mark II and X is the ability to see the info display on the LCD screen and also via HDMI to an external monitor. This is something I've been complaining about for a while, so it's great to see it on the S1R Mark II. If you're in a studio environment where you might be working behind the camera but also referencing an external monitor, you can now see or mirror the information on both screens. It's a really cool addition. Now, there are a couple of quirks to this HDMI port in relation, of course, to the autofocus performance. So if you are running this to an external monitor shooting 8K, body detection disappears. It also disappears in some of the 50 or 60p modes in the regular recording menu. So yeah, it's a little bit hit and miss, but in most of the standard frame rates up to about 5.9K, it works fine. Let's do a quick power round covering some of the features. So the S1R Mark II can support live streaming to destinations like YouTube and Facebook. This camera is also compatible with the Frame IO from Adobe, which allows you to wirelessly transfer files. Now, this works with proxy files, Jpeg, and RAW photos. The S1R is also compatible with the LUMIX Lab App, which allows you to create and transfer custom LUTs to your camera from your phone. Now, real-time LUT has been one of my favorite features since the LUMIX S9, and I'm glad it's made its way to this brand new camera. Like previous cameras, you can overlay 2 LUTs at the same time, and the S1R Mark II will allow you to save up to 39 LUTs internally within the camera. It supports both VLT and cube files. There's also a new app called LUMIX Flow, which is designed to help you create scripts, storyboards, and shot lists for folks working on set. You can select between a few different genres of presets like music videos or documentaries or dramas or whatever, and then visually sketch out the scenes, which helps you visualize shot angles and actors' positions. Once the camera is connected to your mobile, you can use the phone as an external monitor and also rate your takes as ones to keep or ones to disregard. If you've ever worked with storyboards before, like I have in the past, you'll understand how important it is to visualize your shots ahead of time. I would love to see a desktop version of this app ported to a Mac or PC, because I find working on a computer a lot easier than a mobile phone. While we do get a charger, cap, and all the standard accessories, just know there's no actual wall socket power plug included with this camera. So just use your phone charger, or if you've already got a USB PD power supply, you'll be good to go. Alrighty, let's wrap this up and talk about the pros and cons. So first up, the image coming off this sensor is absolutely sensational. The 8K image quality is insane, and being able to punch in so far on a 4K timeline without losing resolution is fantastic. The dynamic range, color science, and the new CineLike A2 profiles are all killer. The CineLike A2 is my new favorite profile, and I hope it makes its way to other cameras in the range coming up. The autofocus, flip out screen, and IBIS system are all great, and if you're a photographer, you'll love this thing. I'm very impressed with the layout of the buttons, the new menu system, and the cropless 4K 50 and 60p recording. If you're in a situation as a video shooter where you don't need to roll for long periods of time, this is a killer camera. We get all the same great video tools and features we've seen on many of the other cameras up until this point, and then some. The photography features and burst rates are insane on this camera, and the hit rate is excellent, even in a challenging situation where someone's running towards the camera trying to trick it. One of the strange limitations to this camera is that it can only shoot 4K or 1080p up to a maximum of 120 frames per second, whereas the LUMIX S9 can shoot up to 180 frames per second in HD, and it looks great. Well, it looks great at 150, but it can shoot a maximum of 180 frames per second. I'm not sure why this is a limitation on this camera. Again, it could be that something else is coming out in the future. While the autofocus on this camera is excellent in most modes, and it uses the new phase hybrid autofocus system, defaulting back to contrast DFD at 4K at 120 frames per second seems a little illogical based on the price of this camera. I think most people would have appreciated having a full frame camera like this that has full PDAF. Some of the full frame cameras on the market from other brands will shoot 4K at 120 frames per second without any limitations on the autofocus. I really was expecting this to be the first full frame camera that didn't default back to DFD in any of the video modes. The marketing around this camera ahead of launch was that this is the new photo video high resolution hybrid camera and not just an update to the original S1R. And it is. It kills just about everything in terms of video features and quality, but it's let down by substandard cooling for these higher resolution modes. If you're a professional video shooter who needs reliability for long-form video, stick with the S5 Mark II or X or until whatever comes next. I think this is an important camera for photographers and hybrid shooters who want excellent video quality and photographic performance, but it won't be for everybody. Again, this is the best image quality I've seen for both photos and video out of any LUMIX camera, and if you can work within its limitations, you'll love it. Thanks for watching.